I'll just quickly introduce you.
Please.
All right, thanks everyone for coming for this Augmented Instruments Lab seminar series. Very happy to introduce Alexander Hawkins, pianist, composer, band leader. We met at Cafe Oto, I guess, about a month and a half ago during your residency there, on the night you were playing with Nicole Mitchell. And super brilliant performance. And we got talking afterwards, had a fun chat about your performances in Canada, where I'm from.
Yeah.
And then also about just performance in general and augmented instruments, and shared a little bit about what we do at the Augmented Instruments Lab. And so really happy to have you here to talk a little bit about your experience as a performer and your experience with augmented instruments and encountering new instruments. So very happy to introduce Alexander Hawkins. Thank you.
Great. Yeah, thanks. I was just saying it's quite a strange experience for me because I did a doctorate like maybe 20 years ago now, and my supervisor was hands-off is the polite way to say it. So the seminar is not quite an alien concept to me, but near as damn it. But for my jumping off point, I guess I'll just explain a little bit about my academic background, because I did a PhD. Well, I've only ever worked professionally as a musician, but my undergraduate degree was actually in law, and then I stayed on at university and went straight into a PhD after that. And law is kind of misleading. It was much more sort of sociology. I was interested in how the law actually works rather than how the books say it works, okay, which is a major distinction. And my particular focus was on negotiation. So, for example, one example might be plea bargains. Yeah, okay, so I was interested in negotiated processes and how these lead to certain outcomes. And one of the things that's interesting about that is that we can consider the same sort of fact situation and all look at it different ways. So if I'm looking at, for example, a plea bargain, so I don't know if everyone's sort of from this jurisdiction or a similar one, the concept being a prosecutor might negotiate with a defense lawyer and say, we'll accept a plea of guilty in return for a reduced sentence. I mean, that's the very crude version, but whatever. Now, as a legal scholar, I might look at that in terms of rules. I might say, how does the outcome deviate from what I might expect according to the law in the books? If I'm a statistician, I could look at the exact same fact situation from a totally different perspective. If I'm a legal historian, again, I'm going to look at it a different way. If I'm an economist, I might analyze what's going on in terms of costs and benefits. If I'm a philosopher, I would look at the same situation and be interested in how the outcome related to traditional theories of punishment, or something like this. And so it's quite interesting coming from a disciplinary background where we're all looking at the same thing, but we're slightly talking past each other. Because one of the things with detailed academic research, like, well, you're all engaged in, and I was, is that at this point in the game, we're doing very detailed work. And that's likely to involve specialized language. It's likely to involve, the pejorative way of putting it would be jargon, and so on. And of course, that's important because we need to express ideas with precision, but it makes it difficult in terms of engagement. And so there's this interesting thing where even within the same discipline, we can slightly be talking past each other. And it's kind of fascinating and frustrating to think that at any one time, we probably know much more about any given thing than we think we do, because universities have to work according to funding models. They have to work according to political schemes and so forth. And it's understandable why universities are divided into faculties, but this isn't necessarily conducive to understanding and understanding and moving things forward. And this can happen even within faculties, for example. I mean, if I'm looking at negotiation, and I'm a legal economist, everything I do is premised on an idea of rationality and calculation. If I'm a sociologist, the idea that people are rational and act rationally is kind of bizarre, and so forth. So we have this thing where we're talking past each other sometimes, and that can be a frustration, but it can also be a positive, I think, is one of the interesting things. And so I guess my jumping off point for this is that I am, involved in new music. That's what I do. I'm a practitioner. I'm out there playing. And I'm hugely sympathetic to everything that's going on here. And yet, I don't quite get it. I don't have the technical vocabulary. One of the things I did yesterday was I just went to the Augmented, the website, and just jumped into a couple of papers at random just to try and situate myself with what's going on. And we're all sort of talking about the same thing, but in a slightly different way. And one of the things that I find really interesting is that this is not a case of a performer coming to talk to scholars, because I know that almost certainly all of you are probably also super accomplished performers. But there's this really interesting thing, isn't it, that when you're that close to the work, it's not seeing the wood for the trees, or sometimes it's learning to identify with the person who, like myself, is super sympathetic, but doesn't quite have the means to engage. And so I take some comfort in thinking that even if everything I say is super naive, and you think, yeah, we addressed these problems kind of ages ago, I'll be interesting because I'm a case study, really, of what you're dealing with in terms of getting the music out there. That's assuming that we want to take things beyond the kind of the composer-performer model, the person who just takes their own instrument around, which is kind of beautiful, but one way to do things. So I guess that's where I'm coming from a kind of an academic point of view. My memorization chops are a little rusty because, like I say, seminars were not really a thing when I was doing my PhD. So forgive me if I jump into notes from time to time just to keep my thread. The other thing as well is, please, I mean, one of the academics that I studied doing my doctorate was, ironically, given what's happening in America at the moment, is Montesquieu. Montesquieu was kind of the guy who sort of kind of misunderstood what happened with American politics and then came up with this codification of the idea of the separation of powers. And there was a book of his that I really liked called Mes Pensées, My Thoughts, and basically he just wrote down a bunch of questions and took it. Or, the poetic version of this would be the Neruda Book of Questions. So it's this idea of just like writing down a bunch of questions and hoping that will guide your thinking. So essentially that's sort of what I did. I just sort of wrote down a bunch of things that struck me as potentially interesting, and then kind of ordered them a little bit. But so much to say that if I say something which is clearly stupid, like, do jump in, or we could open it up for questions sort of at any point, because it's more interested to have a guided discussion rather than me pontificating things I don't know about. My musical background. Okay, so I'm from Oxford, so Oxford's a great music city, obviously, but I came up very much through kind of classical music and jazz, and I perform in settings varying from completely composed in the orthodox sense. I teach kind of a day a week of Bach and Beethoven sonatas and blah blah blah, but also complete free improvisation and lots of stuff in between. And I guess mostly stuff that I do centers around things where there's improvisation in there somewhere. And although my own stuff, I hope, has a focus and is kind of identifiable as mine, I'm really interested in these kind of these sort of liminal, or these situations where you put your own vocabulary into an interesting context. So, for example, on the one hand, I do, contemporary classical music, and when I say, of course, when we say contemporary classical music, we don't always mean it, avant-garde. Okay, some of the nuts, most crazy stuff was, but it might be that. But I've also, for example, toured with the Ethiopian musician Mulatu Astatke for 15 years. I was in the band of Louis Maholo, one of the great South African drummers, for 15 years. I've done, played on film soundtracks, played with some of the, played on hip hop albums and so forth. So I'm interested. This book by Joseph Albers called The Interaction of Color, and this is where you sort of get the red square and it looks different if it's on a. I feel like musically this is an interesting thing to think about, and that's kind of what I do in a sense. But so the point being that I'm kind of really interested in idiom, differences of idiom as well in the music. So let me jump into some of my sort of thoughts, my questions about augmented instruments. And like I say, if any of these reflections are naive in a way, well, that I guess in itself is quite interesting, because yeah, it's the sympathetic performer, and the sympathetic performer who doesn't quite get it. I'm the potential audience in a way. The first thing I suppose is I was interested in the idea that we're calling it augmentation. And what happens to the mindset thinking about extensions of instruments as opposed to new instruments. One of the things that is interesting, and of course, my background as a player, actually, by the way, was also as an organist. And of course, organ's a great place to start if you're interested in synthesis, or even things like non-repeating loops. One of the very famous instruments is in Paris at the Church of Saint-Sulpice, where there's what they have, this has a very famous machine which simulates the noise of thunder and of hail. And the challenge there was to create a sort of a barrel-like structure which made this kind of, but without the sense of sonic cycles, could create irregular, and it won engineering prizes for this. So actually the organ is a good sort of training ground for sort of sympathy towards these things. But thinking about electronic music from my kind of improvising background, one of the very basic things is this sense that electronics are often viewed as an add-on to something. It's something that does well, obviously in a music production sense with adding things like this, but there's a certain hierarchy involved between the electronics and the acoustic instruments. Now, of course, this can lead the discussion in one of a number of ways. One of the things that I think is really important these days is in terms of the sort of the ethics of setting up a performance. Do these instruments set up for us a context where it's okay to have hierarchies? Is it okay for me to ask the machine to have this sort of subservient role? Because one of the things that really bugs me about how electronics are used a lot of the time in the kind of music that I'm involved with is this sense that it's something that's done to the acoustic instrument. It's sort of subservient, and then we get into, one of the things that I might talk about later is this idea of processing and providing input rather than just sort of taking input. But that's one of the interesting things. And I suppose what I'm saying is this. When I'm composing, for example, I'm kind of monstrously self-critical, like cripplingly so, I guess, in some senses. And it's interesting to me to think about what are the cliche cases? What are the cases that I'm trying to avoid in what I'm doing? And one of my problems with one of the ways in which electronic music in particular, and I'm talking about electronics, there's lots of different ways of augmenting, of course, is we can be seduced by the idea of strange sound. We can really be beguiled by these things which are decorations to the sound. And one of my concerns, and as I say, this is something that I guess you're all addressing. One of my concerns is that sometimes we risk this novelty value of the new sound at the expense of possibly the more fundamental elements, musical elements that we may want to deal with. And actually, what I would say is that possibly one of the deepest senses of augmentation that we can involve. We can all do plenty of augmentation just by learning to play our own instruments better. I think of myself, one of the things that's coming into the mainstream of kind of jazz piano language at this point is pianists are liking to play a lot on the harmonics of the instrument. But this is old news, right? We've been doing this, well, for a long, long time. You can go into the Schumann ghost variations, but you can, Henry Cowell, whatever, But it's just beginning. One of the things we can do is actually just get it better at our own instruments. And of course, this is also true of when I think of how I approach my Prophet synthesizer or my SP404, These things are awesomely powerful in a way that I can't even begin to get into. So of course, one of the first bits of augmentation I feel like we can all do is just get better at our instruments, learn our craft in that sense. Okay, so that's the first thing is I'm interested, I suppose, as a performer in augmentations which are not augmentations in that sense of decoration, but there's something more individual, and then of course we get into questions of virtuosity because okay, the 10,000 hours thing is obviously nonsense, but we get into questions of spending time with the instruments and being able to deal on the same level as the kind of as with your what I don't want to be in is, as a performer, is a situation where I'm compromised technically. Granted that you have this whole other narrative, this can actually do interesting things to you as well. Limitation is one of the most interesting ways to achieve things musically, I suppose. And this led me to think one of the papers that I happened to jump into, for example, just at random yesterday, was a paper about the chaos bells. And this really resonated with me as a performing musician because, a lot of this paper was actually to do with, the nuts and bolts of you're going around, you're doing a gig, you sound checking, you taking your excess baggage and so forth. And so there's this really interesting thing that we're dealing with incredible science and innovation, but actually the life of the instrument in a practical sense really impacts how it's thought about, because these things can live in a studio, but if an instrument lives in a studio, how is it going to develop a life beyond this sort of decorative or the gloss or the production side of things? And this is something which is I feels fairly intractable because the issues are real. I was on the train this morning dealing with just mundane. Like my agent was asking about a saxophonist for a project and the size of this is just a saxophone, and we're dealing with these complexities. And I think these things really probably have a very material impact on things. one of the other things that I suppose, and this is related to something I was just saying, is I'm very interested in the extent to which, when you start a doctorate, you have an idea, and then, so we like, the people who don't do them think that the idea is you research something and then you discover something. But of course, how do you know what you're looking for? Okay, so to find the way through the woods, I have to have some sense that I want to get to the other side. To get here from Oxford, I had to say, well, I'm aiming for Queen Mary. I'm not sure how I'm going to do it. But you have something in mind and then find the path and maybe veer off. But it's in some way purposive. And I'm interested with instruments. I suppose the idea it came from, augmenting traditional instruments. Does this put us too far into modes of thinking? I think as a pianist, I have a very fixed way of thinking about things. And I wonder how you guys were feeling about developing instruments, the purposive side. Do you have idiomatic thoughts in mind? And would it potentially be more interesting for non-musicians to be pioneering these instruments in a sense? So how much are we missing a trick? How much are we missing possibility by being musicians? I think of the famous story of when Xenakis went to study with Messiaen, and Messiaen says, your strength is the fact that you basically don't know what you're doing. No, your strength is the fact that you're an architect, or your strength is the fact that you're a mathematician. I say that with, he's an absolute idol of mine, so I say that with no disrespect at all. But this is an interesting way to think about it, because we have this as performers and composers as well, don't we? Obviously the knowledge is kind of a dangerous thing in a way. Is that funneling us into things? So I wonder if we could both, discover insights from people, non-musicians. So idiom. And idiom becomes interesting. For example, models. Things to do with machine learning. One of the things that probably we all feel keenly is there is a real mainstream vocabulary of electronics at this point, right? So everyone will drench things in reverbs. Everyone will put interesting delays on things. We knew about reverse pedals a while ago, and so there's a definite vocabulary of these things. There's the kind of the cliche, the orthodox way of doing these things. But what about I suppose I'm interested in choosing between two different trains of thought here. Okay, so I'm interested, I suppose, in the possibility of machine learning. Let's do that thing. Do these things? For example, AI models? Do they learn idioms? Do they get narrower? The board, because I suppose the cliche, we think of a chess engine, and the chess engine gets better at the game. But do machines learn an idiom? And how problematic does this become? And I suppose this relates to the fact that maybe, I'm talking as somebody who's an improviser. If we're composers, if we're dealing with a fixed structure, these things sometimes become less problematic because I can set the machine going and I can set the parameters in advance. I can sort of regulate things a little bit in this way. But as an improviser, where I sometimes want the maverick input, how can I make this happen? So that's another thing that I'm not clear about. And I say this as somebody who's heard interactive electronics. This is what I was talking about with delays and reverbs and the idioms of interactive electronics really interacting in a very cosmetic way, because when we're improvising as well, just in a purely acoustic setting, interaction, imitation, these things are kind of a drag. But also, you know, interaction and on a very subtle and a very deep level is one of the things that gives us form and structure and empathy and shape in the music. So I'm interested, one of the things that I don't know is, for example, how this balance exists in these models of machine learning, for instance. This is terrible. I have quite a funny story about trying to play an encore from memory recently, which I really wasn't prepared to do. Yeah, actually, that thing about learning idioms and the maverick, I'm actually very hopeful. These are just things that I don't understand rather than I'm pessimistic about. You know, I do think, for example, if you take a very kind of machine-based, that, you know, take something like the music of Nankara or whatever, you know, I do think that this is some of the most human music that was made in the last century. So I'm not pessimistic about the machine as such. Also, actually talk about Xenakis, you know, I just find those, I can't remember what they're called, those, I think they were the last things he was working on, where basically he just tried to take himself completely out of the music. Those, I think they're named after the algorithm that he was using, wasn't it? But you know, they're some of the most sort of human music made. So I'm positive about the possibility for personality and the maverick sensibility. But I think these are things that musicians are unclear about in some way. Taking that tangent from kind of the orthodox ways of doing things, you know, reverbs, delays, and so forth. And actually Nankara as well, you can use Nankara to think about this. I think that one of the things that's interesting to me is creating instruments to do something completely other than can ordinarily be done. I mean, of course, there are very interesting playing aids that we can use. That's one side of instrument design, I think. But you know, in Nankaro's very early etudes, for example, you see this thing of music, which is basically like music for an insanely virtuosic pianist. You know, it's kind of, spend the time, you would get it down. You know, I'm thinking of the Boogie Woogie etudes or number 6, which is like the tango. It's kind of playable-ish. And then soon he thinks, no, hang on. The possibility here is just to do something completely physically impossible, you know, more than 10 notes at a time and so forth and so on. And I think moving the music into impossible territories is an interesting thing. And so I'm curious also about, when you take your sort of technologist hat and don't think as musicians, what you think are the shortcomings, or what are the things that acoustic instruments can't do that you want to lend the world. I think that I was trying to think of this backwards as a way to think about how to you know, critiquing. You know, one of the things is, one of the reasons I was reluctant to play music, right? Here I am talking about cliche and so forth. And I don't want to, you know, especially when we're live streaming, I don't want to play music and say, I think this is cliched. But what are the things that you hear in acoustic instruments and you think, you know, we can do better, we can give them more tools? It would be very interesting to know what those things are. One thing that actually I realized, and this is purely my own shortcoming, but one of the other things, maybe this is to do with the messaging with augmented instruments, is when I was reading these papers yesterday, it occurred to me, you know, doing something I can't already do, that just can't be done, that made me think about this whole world of, say, therapeutic or educational uses of the instruments. The first paper I jumped in was this really nice thing about learning tuning on a violin. And then I was thinking, so actually, yeah, so I can sort of augment my experience. I'm thinking about some of the things that are happening in the idioms of music that I'm working in, whether there be extremely complex metrical ideas or musicians learning to deal with unusual tuning. For example, I mean, a really interesting project involving AI that was released last year, I think, was this guy Steve Lehman with the Orchestre National de Jazz in France. And it was sort of a program that was developed in collaboration with IRCAM. But Lehman studied with, I think, I want to say Gérard Griset, but this spectral harmony. And okay, there are spectralists who sort of will average out the pitches to fit on a tempered scale. But then also there are these, there are these situations where people are learning microtones and the tuning is super precise if you're going to get the sound to kind of glow in that way that it will if you nail a tuning. And actually this made me think, and back to my thoughts about augmenting your own capability on the instrument, that actually this learning function, learning tunings and so forth, this could be an extremely, this is an extremely powerful tool as well. Again, something that I hadn't thought about, and that, yeah. Yeah, one of the things that actually, sorry, just while we're talking about that Steve Lehman project, one of the interesting things about that was, back to this idea of I'm curious about the ability of the augmented instruments to force the issue in a group. In a group of acoustic improvisers, probably the person that I'm not interested in playing is the person who is purely reactive, who's not feeding information into the group. Now, again, this is one of the things that I'm worried will be perceived as slightly naive, but I think most of us regard electronics as something reactive in a way. And so one of my questions, one of my issues is, I think I want to understand the extent to which the instruments can force the issue, okay, can change the dynamic, and their ability, I don't want to recognize that the idea came from me. But then one of the things that becomes interesting is that, nobody likes the person that tries to be a maverick, because that's essentially the least maverick thing you can do, right? Just steamroll everyone. It's not, so we did that in the 60s, about this thing of, be the renegade in the group. And it's such a drag because it's like, the kid who sort of, whatever. So one of the important things I think in improvised settings is to be able to force the issue, to govern things, but to step back, and it's a negotiation. It is to do with there are these kind of power dynamics in groups that we need to be aware of, and it's not having hierarchies as such which is problematic, right? I think, because if I decide to go and hang out with my friends, and if I go to the park and play football, it's fine that we agree not to use our hands. So when you choose the rules, that's okay, It's like, Pelé was no less free because he didn't use his hands. But I'm not sure how this works in the case of interactive electronics. I want something to be able to force the issue. But one of the things that shapes the musical performance, clearly we all know this, but it's not just the instrumentation. It's also the feel in the room. It's the sound in the room. Quite often, if I'm playing solo acoustic piano, you'll notice in a space that there's one frequency which is just popping. So you can work with that, or you can get stuck into a note just to dull the tuning if you notice that something's interesting is happening. So I'm curious about the extent to which the machine can play the room, and also play the dynamic between the people in the room. Because this is one of the really interesting things. This ability to turn on a dime, which human interaction can have. How does this play out with the machine? And this is one of the things that I'm not so clear about. And I think that one of the interesting things, again, two possible ways to go from this point. So that's it. That was all a long kind of, that was one of those musical versions. I was talking about Steve Lehman. One of the interesting things in that project with the IRCAM musicians was that there was one musician in the group whose job was effectively kind of a referee for the computer. He was like, you know, that's not a very interesting choice, or whatever. And this is something, you should just say to me, you just think harder about this stuff. But this is not something that occurs to me, you know. We tend to think of the augmentation as something you set going and you just deal with it on those terms. But the referee, you know, it's a bit like the early days of AI, for example, in, so I mentioned chess earlier, when Kasparov played Deep Blue in the late 90s there, and there was this controversial second game in the match where he got beaten by the computer, and his thought was initially, this is a computer aided by the human decision, because that I know produces something, takes me beyond. And so, so maybe there are really interesting things in that direction. I wondered, for example, about, you know, the possibility of having any given programming effectively sort of running, whatever, 3 versions in parallel, and you're effectively DJing between the choices, you know? That's the kind of thing which, again, possibly helps take things in an interesting direction. One of the things which, to go back to the stylistic variety that I'm involved with musically, I think one of the interesting things that's happening in improvised musics, or musics which integrate composition and improvisation at this time, one of the interesting things is the ability to move towards idiom, or to take, so for example, in the music of Anthony Braxton analyzes the dynamics of music in many, many interesting ways. One of the things that he does, he draws the distinction between composed musics, you know, the stable logics, he calls them, completely improvised musics, the sort of the mutable logics, and then the in-between things, the questions in these sort of open forms of when do we decide to move towards compositional material or towards an idiom. He calls these sub-identity formings. But if you're working in one of his groups, for example, this is a thing which you can cue with one of the other members of the group. So, for example, I have a system of cueing, and I can ask somebody across the other side of the ensemble for a sub-identity forming, and this is veering towards some other territory, maybe an idiomatic territory. So I'm interested also in what is the capability of instruments to steer towards idiomatic territory? Because I'm very used to hearing programs, for example, do incredible things in abstract, timbral, textural ways. I'm less clear where they can take me on in an idiomatic direction. You know, for example, you know, a lot of jazz musicians or improvised musicians these days are kind of interested in playing free music, but I'm interested in freedom to rather than freedom from, right? So in fact, in the performance that Geordie came to see with Nicole Mitchell, we had these 2 completely unscripted, very weird moments in the set where I tend not to look at other musicians too much when I play, other than periphery, other than out of the corner of my eye. And twice in the set, we just immediately started playing the same composition, which is weird because we haven't really played too many compositions in the past. But we immediately just dropped into, one was a Coltrane tune called Peace on Earth, and the other was a composition by Muhal Richard Abrams, who did some amazing things with George Lewis and Muhal's own, actually, computer work. But anyway, but the point is that is freedom too. It's like we can play, yeah, without a meter, without fixed rhythmic patterns. Okay, cool. But freedom too is if we want to play a tune, let's play a tune. That's when you're playing free music. And these are the elements of sort of augmentation, or at least as it applies to interactive situations that I'm not so familiar with. Oh yeah.
Yeah, I mean, this question of idiom, I think, is really interesting, and I'm glad to hear you bring this up. And I guess sometimes you hear this this phrase, non-idiomatic improvisation, which I guess, somehow means that it doesn't fall into a few familiar categories, but it's always seemed to me that is in itself idiomatic in a different way. There's certain kinds of things you recognize it immediately. Oh, it's that kind of music, it's that kind of sound.
Yeah.
And I guess also when people are building technologies for performance, I think sometimes there's this sort of over naive idealism that this technology can sound like anything. It's very open-ended. It could be for anybody to do anything, when in fact what it does is this specific kind of space of maybe textural, free-form kind of sound that invites certain kinds of relationships with the performers. And I guess, what is your experience then in, do you have any experience in working with technologies that you feel like have been able to take you in and out of different idioms, including this idiom of sort of more open-ended experimentation? And kind of what's your relationship to that kind of thing, Ben?
I mean, for a start, I absolutely agree. I think non-idiomatic improvisation is an idiom. I don't buy that. It's absolutely. It's very interesting. One of the things that I feel is, for example, I work with a couple of musicians who are incredible turntablists, and I think one of the things that's really interesting, having talked about cliches like delays and reverbs and this, that, and the other, I was just talking about freedom too, and one of the things is people use them a lot because they sound great, and so I don't want to avoid any sort of common tropes, which is one of the things. And so I find really interesting, for example, turntablism I find super interesting because it's one of these liminal cases. It steers so close to a vernacular from, say, hip hop and so forth, or on the other hand, a kind of an art music thing, the Christian Marclay kind of musics, and so. Yeah, so I performed with turntablists, for example, and this kind of precariousness between idioms has been very interesting and I think is quite fruitful. I mean, one of the things is, in the context of non-idiomatic improvisation, people listening online can't see the air quotes, but is that nobody does non-idiomatic music. It'd kind of be amazing if you could play music having no sense of anything ever, but no. Okay, so quite often musicians are thinking, even in what is said to be non-idiomatic, are coming from a certain direction. So for example, a percussionist may be thinking rhythmically. It doesn't feel rhythmic because everyone else is putting it in, the proverbial grid of the music is way off, and so nobody can hear that they're feeling things metrically. But interesting things can start to happen, for example, in a group. Let's say we're improvising so-called freely, and there's a drummer in the group and there's a turntablist. Well, so if you now, and let's say the turntablist says, okay, I'm actually going to use this Quay turntable and scratch. Okay, so then you've got two little bits of the musical matrix which feel like they could be relating to a certain idiom, and just you begin to ghost in a kind of these territories seem really interesting to me, where we just begin to ghost into a sound world. And again, for example, in this group, the presence of a bass player, the bass player might not be, they might be sort of bowing the tailpiece, but the fact of having the bass in there steers people's understanding, the audience's perception in a certain way too. A really interesting, very concrete example of this is this, I suppose we often think of the idea of non-idiomatic improvisation in relation to Derek Bailey. And there's this late Derek Bailey record made with Jamaluddin Takuma, the bass player, and Calvin Weston, the drummer. And they kind of were playing, they both played, for example, with Ornette Coleman's Primetime, this kind of free funk kind of thing. And so they're playing grooves, kind of quite, not orthodox, but, metrical. And Derek Bailey is over the top, sort of playing ding, dong, ding. But as soon as you have this sort of pointillistic texture over a grid, you can only hear it rhythmically in a certain way. And so I think that there are these possibilities. The other thing is that having shared angst about interaction, how do instruments interact, one of the most beautiful dynamics in music for me is just juxtaposition. So actually, I'm mixing a project at the moment. I'm working in quite an unusual way for me, which is that I'm doing a lot of very heavy post-production, which is a sound that I love, but in my own records I haven't generally done this. But actually just juxtaposition. So actually maybe I don't need to worry that whatever program, whatever max patch is running can't play, I don't know, the chord change to Donna Lee, because I don't need it to. So, because juxtaposition, I think it's interesting because often you say there's no such thing as free improvisation, because you start with the compositional decision of I'm going to do this gig, or I'm going to invite this person, we're going to play together. That's the compositional decision. And I feel like possibly the same is actually true of, inviting the augmented world into the performance. And so actually in mixing this project, where I was deliberately trying to collide quite a lot of sort of groove with some very abstract electronics, juxtaposition can actually just work really great too, I think. So turntablism was the first thing that came to mind. Yeah.
Yeah, that's super interesting. And can I ask a follow-up question around cliche? Because I think that's another word that's often on my mind in this kind of space. And there's a lot of cliche in new instrument design, for sure. Things that purport to be really unheard of before, but actually strangely sound like a lot of other things that were supposedly unheard of before. But it's also a weird concept, because you could apply cliche to anything familiar. Oh, there's a piano, that's very cliche. Piano music, we've heard that before. So how do you, what for you is the kind of trigger that says, oh, this is a cliche versus this is something that's a familiar reference point, but which could be productive creatively?
Yeah, I think that's super interesting, and it's one of the things that I struggle with. As a composer, I sort of have a massive pile of kind of stillborn manuscript, basically. I write something, I think, oh no, wait, I know where that came from. And then it goes. And I think I'm getting better at this, but I feel that one of the things is that, the music on the page is only the first step along the way, and that the interaction between the performers is going to take it in a certain direction. So I think that I think that I personally feel that I need to get better at giving things more of a chance before deciding, so with the kind of electronic world, for example, I feel that the first things that come to mind are the artifacts of the kind of very physical processes. So yeah, the things that were derived from tapes and plates, and so you know, the kind of the reverby delay world, for example, processing which you know, it often feels that the processing, what we perceived as the cliche, the process bit of the sound is somehow penumbral. So you have the main sound and then an aura or a corona around the sound. Things like this, which needn't be so, but you know, it's a very linear concept of the musical time, that you have the event and then something done to it, and it needn't be. And in fact, just thinking out loud, that's one of the interesting things about the resonator piano. You know, it's actually it's kind of great because it's like de-pianos the piano, right? I was thinking, you know, what other instruments could you denature in this way? I mean, it's basically sort of taking away the percussive nature. You know, I was thinking of, you know, when I got up this morning, I was practicing this one of the I think sometimes called the harp etude, you know, the Chopin Opus 25 No. 1, this kind of very rippling thing, and I could just hear my teacher, if ever I would call the piano a percussion instrument, he'd be like, no, it's a harp in a box. It's a harp in a box as well, but it's also, it's 88 tuned drums or whatever. And so actually this is kind of beautiful because it sort of denatures the instrument, and you know, which other instruments could you sort of denature in this way? It's kind of interesting. I don't know. But yeah, so the cliche, I suppose that's one of the things. But then, you know, you know, one of the things that's interesting is we've gone, or sort of the particular kind of slightly grainy sound that we associate with the electronics, for example, in early Stockhausen pieces. You know, it's like, what is that? It's like 75 years ago. It's not new music, but so I suppose these things feel like the cliches, but then weirdly, it feels that in a way there's also a move to run away from these things. And so if you look at you know, a piece that I'm kind of obsessed with is the Nonno, the piece for Pollini, the piano tape Sonde Offerte Serene, with this amazing sort of processed piano on the magnetic tape. And actually it sounds unbelievably fresh now, because it feels like, you know, because this was in the very early throes of kind of tape and piano music, and you know, the piano is, you know, sometimes mirrored incredibly literally, and you think that's not processed at all, that's just a kind of tape delay or whatever, and it's almost like there at some point there's such a move away from these things that people forget also to do the simple things. So it's not totally clear to me what cliche is. What are some other ones? I don't know. It's an interesting. I think the main thing that I hear now, sometimes, you know, when we think of AI programs, for example, the thing that I'm listening for is an interesting thing to happen, an unfamiliar thing to happen to the sound, and it does seem that things gravitate towards this kind of penumbral, like the tail of the comet, you know. And this is what I'm interested in, is what those other possibilities are. You know, I don't know, for example, probably this is something you're like, yeah, we did this ages ago, but you know, with my prophet, my world just went. So my little niece, she just learned to walk. And you know, that moment when the kid can walk, you're like, oh wow, the world is massive. You know, now I can get over there. I don't need to wait for a ride. This was me with LFOs. I was like, oh wow. You know what I'm saying? So, I mean, what if, you know, what if I get, you know, we talked about getting a musician to sort of referee the computer. You know, if I get the computer to control the computer, a different, you know, if I get, is that computer like an LFO? Does it just make stuff go completely nuts? I don't know. These possibilities, you know, these are the things that, yeah, could be interesting. I don't know.
Thank you so much. It was super interesting. There was something you said. I was one of the earlier in the talk. You're talking about this like decoration, and I think it like ties into also this like the novelty of new sounds. As you hear something, it's like, oh wow, that sounds like really fancy and really new. But then it becomes just like a decoration on top, like augmentation and decoration, and something we've been talking a little bit about is that like having an augmentation that it's there and it's present, but it doesn't actually change the way you play the instrument. You're kind of like playing along, and the sound is sort of happening. Maybe it's like a reverby thing, or something synthesized, but you're not actually playing any differently. And this is kind of like happening. And how do you know when it ceases being a decoration and becomes something actually interesting, but also isn't necessarily technically limiting? I guess there's like a balance there that I'm interested in.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. In fact, I was thinking about this literally only last night in this recording I was working with, where I'd set up. I was effectively playing with delays and reversing delays and so forth. And just as I was sort of dealing with the mix, I just soloed the processing, and I was like, actually, that's way more interesting than and really it was just that thing of actually just turn that into the foreground and like get rid of the thing. These kind of questions make me think of the this Miles Davis record, On the Corner, where there's a saxophone solo on that where I think it was played by Dave Liebman. It kind of doesn't matter, but the point being that I think he was I think Miles, they didn't do it live, they were multi-tracking it, and I think the story is that they brought him in to play a solo, but gave him very limited information in the headphones. I think he told him it's in D minor, not what type of D minor, didn't even give him the bass line, but gave the drums. So just changing, so this feels like a sort of a cognate process. One of the things that I was thinking about with these things, and because we all feel it, we're building instruments, I'm swanning off playing concerts. You think, how is this relevant in today's world? There's this massive anxiety. You're like, stuff is so messed up, and here we are like pontificating on the inner mysteries of a B flat chord or whatever. And then you realize, of course, play is important, and but I was thinking of this, and sometimes the answer to all these questions is musically speaking, it doesn't matter, musically speaking. But thinking about these things then sparks that tangent where you think, oh, now this is a territory that I didn't think about. So all of which is a roundabout way of saying I don't know, but it's an interesting question for sure. Limited information to me is very interesting. This is the thing with sort of non-idiomatic free improvisation. People in saying, we're so free, we don't need to play chords, we don't blah blah blah. It's like, well, if your brain is a supercomputer and you can see all the possibilities at any one time, knock yourself out. But we have, maybe this is the sociologist in me, but this is bounded rationality. I can do more when I have a little bit of information to work with. But then, limiting that information, it's like sort of putting just coloring the background noise somehow, just to steer the decision. This is an interesting set of issues for sure, yeah.
Thank you so much. I think there was something you mentioned earlier about this idea of hierarchy and this idea of, how much agency do we give machines? How do we interact with machines? Is this sort of an interaction, or is this sort of something we're building together? And I guess I was thinking about we generally think in terms of agency and what we value as musicians. And so I wanted to ask you in your musical context for how you play instruments, what is the top thing that you need to be able to, that you value, that you need to be able to express, through an instrument, for your practice? If there is one or two things that you would look for in a new synthesizer or a new drum machine, or
Yeah.
new, like, what is something you want to be able to express?
That's really, that's totally fascinating. Yeah. So I think, especially as a musician who comes from classical music, I have an obsession with control. You know, that's the problem with classical musicians, is everything has got to be just like that. And you know, as well, I mean, you know, sometimes all of us, but musicians, you know, obsessive and repetitive behaviors are a real thing. And I used really to struggle with this, like really. So control was my thing, and that's why for a long while I stayed away from electronic music, because if I didn't understand it, I had that classical musician mentality. If I can't make it mine and control it, and ultimately, and at some point, and of course these compulsions are not rational, so this makes it harder. But I think ultimately, I'm excited by the sound is the thing. I want to know, you know, I think the process to me is less important than the outcome. You know, because this comes up a lot. For example, if we were just, you know, it's like when you go to a conservatoire and you do a masterclass, or you know, on the process of improvisation. You know, how do you play? Yeah, I think I'm interested in how it sounds. Like what we're doing doesn't matter. So I think the point is, I don't think I could say in advance. I want it to be. It's really the joy of the outcome in a way, I think, which is not a very useful answer. Well, it's both a liberating answer, which is like, I feel like I once say to an instrument builder, knock yourself out. You know, what have you got? Because that's the thing, is we all have our specialisms. You know, if somebody would ask me, how do I do this on the piano, I could show. But you know, for you, the world of sonic possibility looks very different to me. And so I think that's one of the beautiful things about collaboration in a way, is somebody brings something, you know, you're both expressing your kind of autonomy. It's like when you have a conversation, you're both expressing your autonomy, hopefully, in a very full way, but you end up at a place you don't know where you're going. You know, I guess one of the things is, this is the beauty of kind of experimentation, is also just try it out, isn't it? And you don't need to commit to the result on the, you know, it's not. One of the problems with the kind of the ecology of concerts at this point is, you know, new music as a whole, it's often one and done. You get a commission, it's played, and that's it. That's a drag. That's something that. So that's one of the beauty of sort of experimental spaces like a laboratory such as this. We can work it out. So I don't know. So just like a good conversation, you know, I think it's when somebody, if the designer can show me, look at this possibility, and if I knew where I wanted to go in advance, I'd have gone there or tried. Does that make sense? So it's a bit of a cop-out answer. It's a super interesting question. I just don't know how to.
What was like the last instrument that you bought?
Oh, it was probably. Well, it was probably actually, I just changed my piano, but no, it was a sampler. It was just a SP404. It was, yeah. And I started reading that book about Dilla, and I was like, I should just play around with this stuff. but also, you know, the last instrument that I bought, I mean, was this sampler, but then recently producing this recording, I've actually just been playing with Logic, and I'm like, this is a massive instrument that I just totally can't play. And then, of course, you know, one of the interesting things is we're dealing with psychologies here as well. Like, we're dealing with sort of fragile musicians, or, you know, musicians, like, okay, we're also very proud, right? We want mastery, or at least, you know, and so as a result, I think we shy away from certain musicians. You know, that's why the punk aesthetic is so beautiful. Like the music I'm not so into, but that idea of like, I don't care, let's just see what happens. That's kind of really healthy. Whereas as a classical musician, with Logic, my thing was always like, this is massive. How can I put in the time to get this completely down? And as I'm just sort of producing this recording, I'm just thinking, wow, this is huge. And of course, I could just get help with it. I can just play with it. I can look at possibilities, and misunderstanding the process is kind of great. You know, interesting things happen. And I think that's one of the things that I realized actually in thinking of some of these questions is that it's not important that I understand what's happening, you know, and actually those misconceptions, you know, we were talking about people talking past each other. These are interesting things. And these also happen just with acoustic music. You know, if we're playing metrically complex music and it's in, let's say it's in 5, you know, and a classic jazz thing that people will do is some people will hear 1, 2, 3, 4, sorry, kind of sounds great. So I am getting better with it. You know, it's like some people will hear the short meter and other people will hear the big 5, and sometimes it's kind of great if we don't agree what to feel. And these, you know, one of Mulatu's tunes is this great tune where I got the gig in slightly odd circumstances where I was asked at like a couple of days' notice if I could go and sub for someone on a gig, and of course I'd heard his records, but I didn't know the tunes. And they said, okay, cool, well, come the day before and listen to the show. So on my first gig with him, it wasn't like it was a jam session, but also I was just kind of going on what I'd got down by ear the night before. And there's this tune, which is like it's kind of a funk tune. It's like the bass line is in 6 and the drums are in 4. Now, okay, if you look at the sheet music, then I don't know how it's written. It's probably like it's written in 4/4, and that you hear in a certain way. If you're just trusting your ears on a gig, if the bass player is counting 4 and I'm counting 6, well, that's kind of interesting. And as long as it sounds good, it doesn't matter. I think is the thing in a way. So yeah, that mentality of just having a go, I think, is quite important. And you know, our obsession with control is sometimes. It's also beautiful because it allows kind of amazing things to happen, but it's kind of crippling as well in a way. Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah.
All right, well, maybe we can close. Thank you, Alex. That was amazing. Yeah, thank you so much. Really enjoyed that.
Usually, like ordering my thoughts and stuff is great. So there's a couple of times there where I paused. It's just because it's a really different way of thinking of things. So I'm there, like, you know, like the musical equivalent of that. The shame I couldn't deal with. But so sorry for just like moments of discontinuity there. But yeah.
Thank you.